Hello and welcome to the Virtual Velo Podcast with me, Emma Martin, and my co-host, Chris Schwenker. This is episode 54, and having heard from a number of the UCI World Championship qualifying athletes, the Danish Cycling Union in episode 53, who did indeed have some questions themselves for our guest today. We're joined today by the UCI Esports coordinator, Chris.
Yes, and you know, the cycling esports community can be a very passionate bunch. And it's easy to make assumptions when you don't have the full picture. And I'm extremely excited for this opportunity to address some of the community's questions and share the accurate information straight from the source.
Well, indeed. Welcome to the Virtual Velo Podcast, Jacob Fraser. Thanks ever so much for joining us, Jacob. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting us, guys. Excited to have the conversation.
Well, I think a great place to start is to kind of establish your role and how you got the role in the first place. You bring significant cycling esports experience dating back to the sport's inception while working at Zwift and across multiple platforms. Can you share your background and what led to the UCI bringing you on as the esports coordinator?
Sure. I think like most of us in this profession, I fell in love with cycling at a young age, started hanging out at my local bike shop way too much. And the owner, Greg, finally gave me a job, and it's all been fantastic since then. I managed bike shops, worked as a mechanic and a salesperson for years. And just after university, I moved out to California and was lucky enough to land a job at Zwift pretty early on. I think I was around the 100th employee, give or take. They're obviously quite a large corporation now. I was at Zwift for, I think, just a touch over 4 years. And when I left there, I took a 2-year contract at MyWhoosh in Abu Dhabi as their director of esports and events. And as my contract ended, my son was born a few months before the contract ended. And while I love the team over there in Abu Dhabi, a 12-hour time difference is a little tough with a newborn at home. So I was fortunate enough that the role at the UCI opened up at the same time as my contract was ending, and applied for it, went through a few interviews, spoke with Michael Rogers, and got to come on board then. And I've been with the UCI. This is my second year. We're ending my second year there. So it's been a fantastic ride. And like all of us, I'm real lucky to work in a profession that I'm so passionate about.
So it's clear as to why the UCI would consider you an appealing candidate for that job, but it's also a really difficult job. What motivated you to seek that opportunity with the UCI?
Well, it's something, cycling esports, that is something I've been interested in, as you said, kind of from the sport's inception. When I was at Zwift, I got brought on as what they call a technician role, or essentially a mechanic who has a fantastic technical background as well. And travels around the world setting up athletes or setting up their events. And that group that's still there at Zwift, by the way, they helped to facilitate some of the first racing way back in the day. If you remember, we had the KISS Super League or the KISS Crit Series even before that. And at the time, I had moved up into a brand experience role as well, working with the technical team. And we delivered some of the first real world esports racing that existed. So it was really passionate. I come from a sports background. I've been involved in ice hockey for a really long time, for my whole life, really. I officiate minor professional ice hockey now. So I've always been obsessed with sport. It sounds really nerdy to say, but perhaps from the rule book side or from the governance side. With Zwift, I got the opportunity to help kind of formulate some of that as part of a much larger team that was working in those early days. I got to continue that work at Whoosh to try and legitimize a discipline. And the UCI that's been involved from it from those same early days has always been kind of an aspiration. And like I said, I was fortunate enough that timing worked out and my skill set fit the needs. And I've been really happy working with the UCI since then. It's been fantastic.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because we are coming up to what will be the fourth, I'm thinking strongly there, the fourth World Championships for cycling esports. Why did the UCI choose this moment to speak publicly about cycling esports for pretty much the first time?
I think we've spoken publicly. Previous people at the UCI have spoken about esports at different opportunities. I think very simply because you guys asked is why we're happy to speak about it now. We're always open to the media, and any inquiries we get will be reviewed and answered as we need to. And it's a fantastic event that we have coming up here. Like you said, Emma, it's the 4th edition coming up this year. I've had the good luck of being involved in it from a number of different sides in all 3 previous editions. First at Zwift, helping to deliver the event. The final year that Zwift hosted the World Championships, I had started at the UCI, so I saw it from this side. And when I was at MyWhoosh, we went through the tender process as well. So I've seen it from a couple of different angles, which is a very fortunate opportunity I've been afforded. And yeah, I think the UCI is always happy to speak with people like yourselves who are interested in the sport. We can't answer, obviously, every inquiry that comes across our desk. Our media and communications team's already very, very busy, but I thought this was a great opportunity ahead of the World Championship final in Abu Dhabi here in the end of October to speak with you guys.
Fabulous. And you talk about the UCI media. Is it a team, isn't it? And it's not just you. There is more to esports than just the esports coordinator at the UCI. Can you explain that management structure within the UCI around that specific role of esports?
Yeah, certainly. And we'll touch on this topic a number of times, I think. I'm very fortunate to have the role that I am, and I'm very thankful for being involved in sport at such a high level. But like you said, it really takes a ton of folks to do it. And it's across multiple organizations as well. Obviously, the delivery of previous world championships, the evolution of a new sport, a new discipline, takes a ton of people. Sport, one of the most magical things I find about sport in general is that it's bigger than any individual. Especially for those of us on this side of the table, or rather on this side of the bike. None of us are going down in history as world champions. At least I'll speak for myself. I'm not ever going to go down as a world champion. But to get to play a small part in that is really, really rewarding. To answer your question a little bit more specifically, the esports function falls under major events and Olympic programs at the UCI. And that falls into the broader kind of sports department. And the sports department obviously ladders up into the director general and the president of the UCI, who regularly reports into the management committee. So it fits nicely within the broader team. Like you said, I'm certainly not the only one, but there's quite a few folks at the UCI that are working on esports pretty consistently.
So, Jacob, the community do chat, and they do chat a lot, and a lot of the discussion has been very much about, is this esports that just happens to be cycling, or is this cycling that is a new discipline called esports? And in relation to that, where you sit on that fence really is important around, the UCI's importance to cycling esports. As I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I'm assuming you as the UCI have an assumption about how that sits.
Yeah, I think the answer is actually both. Something can be two things at once. We certainly view cycling esports as a standalone discipline, a legitimate sport on its own right. You guys have talked about this. We've all talked about it. You see the development of athletes specifically for esports. I think one of the recent podcast episodes talked about, is esports going to forever be a pathway to the World Tour Road Peloton, or is it going to be its own standalone, commercially viable discipline? That's yet to be seen. Time will tell. But on the other hand, you have a vibrant esports community that perhaps could get involved in a little bit more of a traditional sport. I think you can differentiate esports through three lenses: either traditional esports, something like a League of Legends or a Fortnite, a console-based game. You can then have simulated sport, which is playing a baseball or a football or a basketball video game on the controller. Or you have physical esport, which your hands and joysticks aren't the only propulsion of your avatar, it's your legs. There's different versions of it: taekwondo, virtual regatta, things like that. So you can look at it through a number of different lenses. From my personal perspective, cycling esports is a standalone discipline, a legitimate sport unto its own right. And it's our job as a community and as the UCI to help legitimize and stabilize it so that these athletes can make livings and we can have a commercially viable product that can compete with all the other disciplines that are currently commercially viable.
So then one of the major questions that comes up in the community quite often is it important for cycling esports to have the UCI support, or is it more important for the UCI to have cycling esports?
I think like any relationship, it takes both sides. There's no relationship I can think of where authoritative power can be imposed one way or another. The French Revolution is a great example of how terribly that can go wrong. I have a history degree, so I perhaps look a few hundred years into the past too often. But I think very simply, it takes both ends, both the community who has been instrumental in developing this discipline, going all the way back to the early days where the UCI was yet to be involved. But on the other hand, we as the UCI certainly have, let's say, the historical precedent to stabilize and legitimize sport. We've been around for quite a while. We've done this through other disciplines. We've helped to standardize and kind of neutralize any advantages from a commercial perspective. And we've helped to stabilize disciplines across cycling. So it's certainly not the UCI's discipline to do with what we see fit. We're here to be a part of the community and bring people to the table to have the conversations, because regardless of what the community may think or what the UCI may think or what anybody in between may think, none of us have the answers, right? We have to collectively come up with the best steps forward, and we're all going to make mistakes and have to change course. And so we as the UCI certainly want to be a partner to all of the other partners at the table to help evolve cycling esports.
So one of the really great ways to get an indication as to how well an organization is taking care of things in the present is to get their vision for the future. Tell me, what is the UCI's vision for the future of cycling esports? What initiatives do you want to put in place to develop and evolve the sport, and what challenges to getting to where you want to go?
Yeah, certainly that's a very fair question. The answer of where we want esports to go has an endless number of possibilities. I personally want to see Olympic inclusion, and I also want to see a commercially viable competition structure, right? Something that you can tune into on broadcast television or athletes can make a living participating in. I think from a sporting fan's perspective, that's where I want to see it going. But Chris, you asked that question very well in terms of what do we need as a sport to do that, or what anybody else thinks should be the future of cycling esports. We've identified at the UCI 3 main pillars we feel are critical to establishing and legitimizing esports for the future. Those 3 being hardware authentication or standardization, performance verification, and then international ranking or standardization. We need to do a couple of things across a few different areas to try and make the sport at its very basic level fair and help to support its integrity across different hardware platforms, different platforms for publishers and gameplay. So there's quite a bit we need to do across all 3 of those, but those are the 3 pillars the house needs to be built on in our perspective.
With 3 pillars, Jacob, where do you start?
The community would say all 3 at once immediately, right? And that's what we're trying to do. We've made progress on all 3 areas. We're working with Dr. Monson and Purdue University to help homologate hardware that's commercially available. We've taken a step forward for the World Championships on that front this year with MyWhoosh and Elite as an example. That's certainly a long and arduous pathway ahead, but one we've already begun work on. When you talk about performance verification, or rather data security in a number of ways, we've had early conversations with both platforms and hardware partners. That one's going to take a little bit longer to do. And I think the community's question of will independent performance verification exist soon is a hard question to answer. But again, we've begun that conversation both internally and externally at the UCI. And then as far as racing standardization or sanctioned racing, that one's a little bit more nebulous because you need the first 2 in order to do that. If you have inconsistencies between the platforms or inconsistencies amongst hardware platforms, you simply cannot have standardized racing across multiple platforms or multiple hardware partners. That one probably comes second, but we're working through performance verification, standardization, as well as hardware standardization really as quickly as we can.
And that authentic performance is really important, isn't it? In terms of, I think about cycling governance. I think about the fact that doping control come down into races. In esports environment, that's really difficult because of the innovation and the technology, etc., that you've got as well on top of the athlete performance. So what's the UCI's role in this sort of fostering this authentic performance, sort of combined with that innovation and technology as well as the athlete?
It's a very complex question, as you alluded to there. We have the human performance verification, and there's some fantastic partners that already exist, like the ITA, to help us support that. And we can certainly implement that. It may require quite a few more home visits than perhaps other cycling disciplines, but it's something we've begun working on. This year's World Championship final will have more robust anti-doping measures than we've ever seen, simply because they're all going to be in the same location. So it makes it quite easy. As far as hardware or performance or data verification, basically between the athlete's legs and whatever server that the game is running on, there's quite a bit of work to do. The community's done a fantastic job of pointing out where some of those kind of vulnerabilities lie. And you've seen a fantastic explosion, really, of community members or even perhaps platform staff attempting to solve those vulnerabilities and step in. And MyWhoosh has a great performance verification system in place. Zwift and some of the independent bodies they work with are trying to develop it. We've seen some come and go over the years as well. I think from my personal perspective, we have to let the commercial industry swell and then right size. You'll see quite a few people come and go from that space. Different ideas are going to come and go. And we need to let that stabilize ever so slightly. And again, this kind of alludes to platform standardization as well. What data is publicly available from each platform? What does that go through? And the question of how do you validate a performance in a virtual setting is rather complex. I've spent quite a bit of my time working on that question, and I have a fair answer to it, but I don't have all of the answers, and certainly no one does. So we're working with a lot of independent partners outside of the UCI as well as our commercial partners to try and help stabilize that. But I think, to put it very plainly, the industry needs to stabilize a little bit. And when we have someone standardize it independently, then the UCI will be able to support that a little bit more easily.
Now, you mentioned the independent verification and having an entity that can do that. Is there one that fits that bill as of now, or are there still challenges that are in place?
I think there's certainly still challenges in place. The old adage of checking your own homework is difficult to argue with. It's hard to claim independence if it's fully in-house, but perhaps I'm a bit of an optimist, much to the chagrin of people on the internet. So I think those that do, quote unquote, check their own homework do so independently. For something like the UCI Cycling Esports World Championship, nobody is checking their own homework. We're getting very detailed data from partners like MyWhoosh and reviewing it ourselves with our commissaires. So there's none of that involved in the UCI side of things. As far as an independent body that currently exists, I have yet to see one. I think those that do exist have positives to offer and also hindrances that are stopping them from being entirely independent or entirely successful. And we'll have those conversations if and when they're necessary to help support that independent verification. I don't think that there's anybody in cycling esports currently who disagrees that an independent performance verification needs to exist. We all have our own opinions on how or when it should exist, but it's something the UCI is committed to and something that will occur as the industry kind of swells and then right sizes.
Now, I know that seems like you've tried to kind of allude to this question, and I'm going to ask it straight out. And I know that it's going to be more of a conceptual thing than probably what you can answer. But from the UCI's perspective, what will it take for cycling esports to be recognized as a professional sport?
That's a fair question. How do you define professional sport? I think in its most basic level, professional sport is a discipline or an industry that allows commercial viability, right? To have both commercial partners and perhaps athletes make a living wage off of it. And from my perspective, that's certainly, you look at, again, traditional esports, things like League of Legends or Fortnite, and that exists. There are professional Fortnite players that make a full-time living doing it. I cannot see any reason why that can't exist for cycling esports. We've seen it through other disciplines. There are professional cyclocross racers and professional mountain bike racers. And now there's even professional gravel racers and Gran Fondo racers. So from my perspective, to make cycling esports a professional success, it's having riders, teams, and competitions be commercially viable. Outside of that, in my opinion, it currently is a professional sport. We have seen athletes train specifically for it. We've seen a slowing of this idea that top-level esports athletes are only there to then go out on the road. Many of the esports athletes have stayed on esports. And then we've even seen this new wave of athletes come up that are simply here for esports. They don't have those road aspirations, or perhaps they do, but they see commercial viability in esports. So the early signs are there from a legitimate professional sporting perspective. Certainly needs more growth, more commercial stability, things like that. But I think there's no reason we can't get there.
Talking about getting there, Jacob, one of the things you have sort of talked about and you've touched on in your last few minutes is the different commercial partners in the space. Are there any initiatives that the UCI is pursuing to enhance collaboration between all of the different various commercial partners in the space at the moment? Or is it a case of, as you've sort of alluded to, let it grow, see where it gets, and then take a look at it?
I don't think I could be more wishy-washy on some of my answers if I was intending, but I'm going to say it again. It's a little bit of both, Emma. Previously at the UCI, I worked with Michael Rogers, one of my favorite people I've ever worked with and a fantastic member of the UCI. Obviously, he would agree with me when I say that sport is bigger than any one person. As a professional cyclist formerly and a former world champion, he knows how many people it takes to make a sport work. But one of the things that he said quite frequently in our time together was, a big part of our job at the UCI is simply to bring people to the table. And I think that's very, very important in this sense. From cycling esports, perhaps the UCI gets a bad reputation that we're coming in to take over what has been a community grown sport up until this point. That's not true. Some people might argue that we're only getting involved now that there is money on the table. That's also not true. We've been involved much earlier when the financial upside to cycling esports wasn't quite realized yet. The UCI's main goal as this independent international federation is to maintain our neutrality and allow people to come to the table and have conversations. I think hardware homologation is a really good way to emphasize that. We haven't picked a hardware partner that should be the UCI's official trainer. We're going to offer it up to anybody who has a commercially available piece of hardware to go through this homologation process and get the rainbow stripes and the UCI sticker stamped on their boxes approved by the UCI. If you look at kind of a similar relationship to road cycling, how many frames are available at your local bike shop that have that UCI homologation sticker on the down tube or on the seat tube? That's a great example. 10, 15 years ago, that didn't exist. And you had carbon frames coming apart at the seams, quite literally. The epoxy was coming out of them. And so our perspective at the UCI is simply to bring people to the table. Now, part of that is certainly going to be that there are too many people at the table at different times. Not every community member needs to be involved in the decision-making at the highest level. Certainly, we all can recognize that. But understanding which groups have commercial viability or stability is very, very important. You don't want someone at the table who's relying on the next round of funding or who may disappear in 6 months' time and no longer be relevant to the conversation, or is perhaps speaking for a minority of the user base, right? If a platform only has, let's say, 5,000 riders and they all happen to be British, because I enjoy picking on the British folks every chance I get, we can't take them as representative of the whole body. They certainly have an important voice, but they shouldn't make every decision. So that's what I'm trying to understand or help the community understand, where we have to go through this natural swelling of the sport and the commercial partners and the people who are trying to make independent versions of performance verification, or perhaps are listing out ways that the sport is vulnerable. Let's see that swell and kind of right size itself amongst the community. And the UCI is going to always be open to having a conversation with anybody who is passionate about the topic of esports. That's certainly true.
Well, the things that you've said about the future, the three pillars, the fact that we're now seeing athletes that are esports specialists. I call them the new breed of esports athletes. They are focused on esports. And you also mentioned previously that the community wants things now. What can you tell that athlete who has put all of his eggs into the esports basket? When are we going to have these things? What is the time frame that they're looking before they're going to be on the World Cycling Esports Tour?
I think we've already made steps in that direction, right? Look at what MyWhoosh has done or is currently about to do for the UCI Cycling Esports World Championship here in Abu Dhabi in a few weeks' time. That's a massive step forward. And even looking back, I shouldn't say that. I really enjoy getting nostalgic, but perhaps this isn't the time or place for it. But I can remember vividly standing in a venue in London when the KISS Crit Series had its first kind of in-person race with 10 athletes. And there was a lot of unknowns. And if I remember correctly, the prize money that Zwift put up for that event was $500 to the winner. And now you have something like Sunday Race Club on MyWhoosh that has a legitimate prize money pool every month. So we've already seen it in just a few years' time. I'm of the personal belief that things that are rushed typically aren't perfect, or perhaps have greater vulnerabilities than if you slow down ever so slightly. So to answer the question very simply, Chris, soon, as soon as we can. But I'm not the commercial entity that is putting up the funding. And I'm just one person at the very large organization known as the UCI that oversees all of cycling. So we're trending in that direction. We're heading in that direction. We haven't stagnated or stalled in any of our progress. So continue to be patient with us, please. I beg the community to do that. We have the best interest at heart. A lot of us have been involved in cycling since we were kids. And many of us are just simply passionate about sports and want to stabilize and legitimize our sport as best we can. So it's coming, certainly. Somebody who has very deep pockets could start a professional league very, very soon. Who knows? But it is certainly coming.
I'm going to change tact slightly because you sort of, explored sort of the UCI, the structures, the plans, the vision, the future, the possibilities. Let's talk about those World Championships, which are coming up very shortly. And let's maybe delve maybe a little bit into the tender process first, because things changed a bit. Can you explain what the tender process entails? Because I think everyone hears about a tender process, but they don't actually understand or know what the specific process was or is. So can you explain what that entails and what the UCI is seeking in a platform host?
Certainly. I can only speak from the esports perspective. That's the only tender process I've ever been involved in at the UCI. But as I understand it, they're pretty similar across disciplines. When a world championship comes available, we issue what's called an invitation to tender, or an ITT, to all relevant parties. In our case, that's typically software publishers, people like Zwift, MyWhoosh, Ruby, all of the independent all of the independent software developers. And we outline in that the expectations of the UCI as it relates to, in traditional road cycling, we would call it the local organizing committee, or the LOC, the entity responsible for delivering the event. In our case, in cycling esports, that's often a publisher like a Zwift or a MyWhoosh or someone else. And in our invitation to tender, we outline the expectations that we have, and the things that we need to kind of tick off in order to deliver this event. And then we ask a handful of questions as well. This tendering parties' ideas for the discipline, what are their hopes and their dreams, not to sound too aloof on the topic, but what do they want to bring to the table from a creative standpoint or from a marketing standpoint, or how do they want to partner with us at the UCI to help develop the discipline? Then we review those amongst a group here at the UCI. We fill out a kind of report card of each party's response to our ITT, ask any clarifying questions that we may have or we may need before making a decision. And then our management committee makes the ultimate decision on who to award that tender to.
There were a few changes this time around, weren't there? Because there was a switch to a 3-year term, and the process was opened up to non-software platforms as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, certainly. And to be clear, the tender process was never closed to non-software partners. I think what we saw in the early days of the Esports World Championship was that only software companies were interested in it. And a kudos to the evolution of the sport over the last handful of years, and that independent commercial entities have now become interested in it. So we simply clarified that you don't have to be a platform in order to bid. Obviously, that would be a bit like a city without roads bidding on the Road World Championship. You need roads in order to host that event. We need a platform in order to host our event. So we always anticipated it to be a dual bid at the very least, have a software company, perhaps with the backing of an independent commercial entity that is not a software company, but it was never against the tender to do that. We just didn't have kind of the reputation yet to do that as a discipline. And then the 3-year tender, that has been requested every year we tendered, is can we please bid for a multi-year tender? I think when you look at it from the responding party's perspective, while a world championship is a very notable event and a very prestigious event to host on your platform, these companies have other initiatives across the board that they have to deliver each year, either to their stakeholders or to their shareholders or whomever they are responsible delivering it to. And we as the UCI and the sport holistically are asking for a significant investment, not just financially, but from a resourcing standpoint in order to deliver this event. And that instability of year over year having to rebid and then hope to win it again, it was just starting to kind of truncate the willingness to invest in the event. So everybody who bid previously asked for a multi-year bid. And we simply offered that in this term. That was all. It's just a 3-year bid. It will come back available in 3 years' time. And it's not unheard of in esports or in even traditional sport to do that.
How would you assess the level of interest that you got or you get in this sort of tender process? Are you often surprised by who puts in or which platforms and which organisations? Is there a first sift and then a second sift, or is it literally who is in that's on the table at the final round?
I'm always surprised. There's always people you didn't expect to bid, or perhaps you expected to and didn't. That's just the business of our sport. Everybody's treated equally. Everybody's reviewed fairly and independently. There's not any level to which we do it. We take all the bids that are in by the deadline, and it goes through the exact same process as all the other bids. So no surprises in terms of who won or who didn't win or who bid or who didn't bid. It's a very unique process that we go through. And I think everybody is pleased with the outcome. And there's been conversations that's happened between different platforms, and it's by no means a certainty that we'll continue down this path in the future. We'll revisit it in a few years' time and see what the sport needs at that point.
The tender process was quite a shock to the community. I think that that's probably an understatement. I cannot think of any other way to ask this question than to just come right out and ask it. What factors influenced the UCI's decision to award the tender to MyWhoosh for that 3-year term?
Speaking from my perspective alone, not the whole UCI, we were looking for a partner who was willing to invest in the discipline to help evolve the sport. And MyWhoosh met that standard. They are willing to both financially and from a resource perspective invest. Not to say that others weren't, certainly not. Everybody was willing to invest, but we felt that the investment that MyWhoosh was willing to make would help to legitimize and stabilize the sport for the next 3 years. Simple as that.
You mentioned that the platforms and the standardization of the platforms was one of your pillars and the future vision. Did limitations of any of the platforms, such as finish line imagery, factor into your decision at all?
No, I think every platform has strengths and weaknesses from a technical standpoint. They're all very self-aware of those and have their own independent reasons for why it does exist or what issues they feel they need to fix first. And that's their right as a commercial entity. We felt everybody who bid had a legitimate chance at delivering the event fairly and equitably to all the athletes. So none of that was involved in the decision-making process from my perspective.
So in addition to the Esports World Championships, the UAE is set to host several prestigious international events. That's including the 2024 UCI Cycling Urban Championships, which I think are actually going on right now, the Road Worlds in 2028, and then we have the Track Worlds as well. Did the UAE's investment in cycling infrastructure and ambitions to become a global cycling hub factor into that decision at all?
I think it did, but no more or less than any other independent organization's commitment to cycling. What the UAE is doing for sport, health and wellness, and cycling very specifically is fantastic and should not be glossed over. They're doing a great job of investing in cycling infrastructure. They're clearly passionate about the sport. Do we need to talk about UAE Team Emirates or UAE Team ADQ on the women's side? I think not. They're fantastic road programs. They're investing in that infrastructure, like I said. But our other platform partners are doing a whole bunch for cycling as well. Look at what Zwift is doing with the Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift, as well as a number of other platforms, their partnership with Canyon SRAM and other professional teams. Everybody's investing in cycling as a sport holistically, and UAE's investment or MyWhoosh's investment and partnership in cycling was acknowledged, but I don't think it unduly influenced the decision at all. Everybody's investing in cycling.
So we hear your answer as far as why MyWhoosh was awarded the tender, but that doesn't always align with the community sentiment. How does the UCI balance that community sentiment with concerns over financial motivations, particularly regarding support for organizations and nations seeking to enhance their reputation through sport?
I think it's a fair question to ask and not one that I'm equipped to answer holistically on behalf of an organization like the UCI. From my perspective, looking at investment into sport for its population should be viewed as a positive for any nation. Investing in sport is fantastic. How much research is done on the health and wellness of children from a team sport perspective, or in the stability of a region, because they have this camaraderie that is sport, especially at a national team level, right? I'm, again, a big sports fan. I watch the Olympics every few years and certainly start cheering for sports I never knew anything about prior to the Olympics. But I get very passionate very quickly. So from a sporting perspective, investing in sport, I feel should always be seen as a positive. Why it's done or what it's attempting to do in response to that investment is not for me to decide. I've personally spent time in the UAE. I think that their nation is a leader in the region from a political and socioeconomic standpoint. It's a place full of opportunity, and sport is one of those opportunities, certainly. And I would encourage anybody online who has anything to say about the nation to go and visit, see for yourself. Don't read anything you can on the internet and make your decision there. Go see it in the real world and make your decision after visiting.
Jacob, I am going to turn the vehicle again a little, because last episode we had Martin Jorngaard from the Danish Cycling Union on. Really, really interesting in terms of the esports coordinator there at the Danish Federation, and they've had huge amounts of success. But he didn't fulfill his task, his homework of sending me a list of questions for you. But I do concur with some of the things he actually said. And I think what I'd really like to explore is, what is the UCI's relationship with national federations around esports?
Very simply, the UCI can't deliver many of our initiatives without our national federation partners. They're the lifeblood of cycling in their nations. Many federations are deeply involved in cycling across all of the disciplines. Martin and the Danish Federation is a great example. Other federations certainly need greater resources or greater investment into different disciplines. And that's for their national federation to make decisions on individually, right? We've seen a good example from the semifinals of this year's Cycling Esports World Championship was a nation like Myanmar had riders, Hong Kong had riders, the Philippines had riders, very small national federations who made a commitment to cycling esports. You then see other nations, perhaps larger nations, where you expect to see that investment, and it's not quite up to what the athletes are demanding. We're committed to working with our national federation partners to help them have the resources or the dedicated resources for cycling esports. But they're massive organizations a lot of times, and other times they're just one or two people. And so we want to support them to develop disciplines that are most beneficial to their national representation and their national interests. And however they see fit to do that, the UCI is here to support.
One of the things Martin did talk about last week was about, a little bit like you, about the variance between national federations and how some are really moving forward with esports, others are a bit more hesitant. And he did actually sort of talk about the relationship between the federation and the UCI, and about whether there would be more of an institutional framework from the UCI to help those federations meet the standards that you require or you are looking for to ensure the growth and evolution of the discipline. Is there, or will there be, this type of institutional framework that he was sort of seeking?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the question around an esports commission or a management committee decision. So certainly as the sport develops, because the UCI still has limited resources ourselves, right? We're not this endless entity that can do everything for everyone. We're certainly trying, but we have our own limitations as well. As the sport continues to develop and grow, we'll revisit the necessary investments that we have to make from a resourcing standpoint. And again, we can't do much without our national federation partners, so we want to support them as best we can. I think you look at a gentleman like Martin specifically, or a nation like Denmark holistically, and they can very much be seen as the kind of on the forefront of cycling esports from a national federation perspective. And kudos to them for that. And we're very appreciative of their support and dedication. We're probably not doing enough for people like that and federations like that. And on the other hand, there's federations who don't have the time or the resources to invest in cycling esports holistically. And so from their perspective, perhaps we, the UCI, are a little bit too prescriptive or too deeply invested in esports, and maybe we're missing something in another discipline that they're more passionate about. So it's a very large balancing act. I don't have the exact number of how many national federation partners we have, but it's in the hundreds, certainly. And they all have their own unique interests and their own unique kind of restrictions and constraints. And we just want to work with them. So to someone like Martin and the Danish Federation, I say thank you, and please be patient with us. And to the others who perhaps haven't been as dedicated as they have been up until this point, let me know and let us know what you need and how we can help, because we do want that standardization. And we want athletes from all nations to have access to the sports. Perhaps one of the most powerful things about cycling esports is that you can access it from home. It's a relatively safe way to access cycling. You don't have to go out on the roads or out into the forest on a mountain bike downhill course. It's lower risk than a lot of other disciplines. And so hopefully federations see that as a pathway to get more members involved in cycling in their local communities.
Yeah, and that's one of the other interesting things, isn't it? You don't need to be a member of your federation or have a racing license to race esports. I sort of assume in this whole governance bit that actually that is a fundamental challenge, because you don't know how many people, you don't know what the requirements are. And if you're not a member of your national federation as an open pathway for a semi-final, and you qualify for a semi-final, and then you go to get membership of your national federation. The British phrase would be cart before the horse.
I think that's a fair way to put it. And certainly we need, as a discipline, to get that in order a little bit. The cart goes after the horse in a lot of ways. I would encourage anybody who owns a bicycle to be a member of their national federation. You get a lot of benefits from being a member of your national federation. And at the very least, you support cycling holistically. So I would encourage everyone to be a member of their national federation. That would solve a lot of this problem. But we also don't want to put up barriers to entry to our new discipline either. You shouldn't have to pay someone $35 or whatever your national federation charges to race your bike in your garage or your basement on a commercial platform, obviously. So to that end, I think if you're taking esports seriously, if you, the rider, or you, the federation, are making demands on the sport to be commercially viable and legitimate, then you should be willing to participate from a membership standpoint as well, right? Be a member of your national federation, help to contribute to that evolution, both financially as well as from a resource standpoint, just riding your bike more often and racing more often and talking about bike racing more often. So it's a little bit of a also and answer. We certainly, as the UCI and our national federation partners, need to do more to help people get involved in esports. But those that are involved in esports can certainly help to contribute to that growth or that stabilization as well.
I am just going to ask one further question on federations, because in relation to the World Championships, we did have an incident with two of the riders who had qualified working with their federation, or shall we say, not having the benefit of their federation supporting them to move forward and progress in that competition. What steps are the UCI taking to prevent similar issues in the future?
We're communicating with our national federation partners earlier. I think this year presented a unique challenge from a yearly calendar aspect. We put the race for the semifinals at a time when many federations were preparing for the Road World Championships. Many of the riders were still in their Pro Continental or World Tour commitments as well. So some smaller federations were perhaps a bit strapped from a resourcing standpoint, just even answering emails, right? If there's only a few folks working at the federation, the end of the road season, the beginning of the cyclocross season can be a very busy time for them. So apologies to the athletes who feel they haven't had the support from their national federation or who objectively did not receive that support. It's something we want to improve in the future. We're trying to speak with our national federation partners earlier to help alleviate some of that last minute stress. And it's something we can only improve upon for the following years.
Okay, now we're going to get into the fun stuff. We're going to talk about the World Championships now, because we're obviously really excited about this. This is going to air probably a week before the event, which is coming up. And I want to speak about the Cycling World Championships in depth, but I think that a good place to start is conceptually, holistically, just the whole framework of the event. And this question has come up on this podcast in the past as well. Just thinking of the World Championships, is it a UCI event and there is a host platform? Or is it a platform event and the UCI is endorsing it or rubber stamping it?
It is a UCI event. Every World Championship across the cycling disciplines is sanctioned by the UCI. So this is a UCI event. We have a fantastic partner with MyWhoosh. But there's a reason it's called the 2024 UCI Cycling Esports World Championships presented by MyWhoosh.
That's a pretty
as direct as I can make it.
Concise answer to that question. Okay, so as we dive in a little bit more closely into the actual event itself, the timing of the event is a challenge for, as you said, the federations. A lot of the athletes, it butts right up with the road and gravel worlds, and it's actually conflicts with the track world, which is coming up very soon. Would you reconsider the timing? And if so, where do you propose that you would put it?
One of the benefits to cycling holistically at the minute is that is a very diverse and very busy calendar. There's a lot of elite level cycling events across the 12 months that we have on the calendar. Finding an ideal time to slot in another world championship is very, very difficult. There's always going to be a conflict, to put it simply. I think this year was a shift. We actually have gone back to what the initial Esports World Championship was in its first edition in kind of the Northern Hemisphere autumn. We'll revisit it after the event. There's benefits and disadvantages to the time of year that it is currently scheduled, but I think moving it into that February, March timeline has a different set of conflicts and a different set of benefits to weigh out as well. So it will be reviewed, certainly. I think moving an event on a calendar has an enormous amount of complexity. you have to recycle essentially or adjust the cycle of a world championship. That's difficult to do. I don't have a full stop that this is the incorrect time to host the championship. I think it's a great time to host the championship, but we'll revisit it after the event and see if we want to move that with our partners across a number of different parties, MyWhoosh obviously being a big part of that decision as well. But I don't think it's a bad time or a good time. I think every time is a good time to host a world championship.
This year is a little different because there are some wild card entries as well. What's the UCI vision for including wild card entries straight into the finals, and how are the athletes selected?
Wild cards have always been a part of our world championship on the esports side of things. The qualification pathway to get into the world championship has evolved over the past few years and the few editions that we've done. I think you see national federation quotas, and this year was a massive step forward. Those quotas were allocated based upon the results in previous editions of the World Championships, which is a great step for our sport. We also will always maintain an open qualification pathway. We believe firmly that esports is one of the unique disciplines where you can get these somebodies that certainly exist out of nowhere, and that's a fantastic way to get them into the World Championships. And then because of the newness or the early days of our discipline, a wild card entry is always going to be applicable. We want to see the big road names or the big cyclocross names cross over into esports. Given the time of year that we're in, perhaps they didn't have the ability or the structural time to qualify through one of the earlier opportunities, whether that be their national quotas or the public qualification. So it's something we've had a part of the World Championships for esports every edition up until this point. And hopefully it's one of the unique things about our discipline in the future that athletes from other disciplines can cross over through the wildcard application process.
So as the esports coordinator, what is your role on the ground in Abu Dhabi? What safeguards are you making sure are in place as far as the technology, support of the athletes, the commercialization of the event?
Yeah, I think very basically the UCI's primary concern is ensuring that we have a fair and legitimate race. We are a sporting body at the end of the day, so we're interested in ensuring that the sport is executed fairly and consistently. There's no disadvantage or advantage gained by any of the athletes, or treatment is different amongst the athlete field, whether that be gender to gender or anything like that. So from our perspective, we're going to Abu Dhabi to support our partners at MyWhoosh deliver a fair and legitimate event. And we'll bring, obviously, the independent bodies necessary to do so. We have a commissaire on the ground with us. We'll be partnering with the ITA from an anti-doping perspective. We'll go through a number of different hardware checks as well. So simply there to help legitimize and stabilize the sport.
How would you assess the success of the event?
It's a very good question. From my personal perspective, exciting racing, right? That's what's going to make a successful event. Obviously, the technical infrastructure needs to hold up. The athletes need to feel that they had a legitimate and fair chance at winning the rainbow stripes with no disadvantage outside of their own ability that day. Technically, that will create a successful event, but perhaps from a fan perspective, I want some very exciting racing, which we saw in the semifinals. I have no doubt we'll see it in the finals as well, but we need a stable and fair race to occur for each athlete to have the ability to shine in their own right.
So two athletes are going to have the honor of pulling those rainbow bands over their heads. And a question that comes up is, what value does that bring to those athletes, to the sport, to the commercial partners, to the UCI, the media coverage, the fans? How would you characterize the value that the rainbow stripes and the UCI and the World Championships brings to cycling esports as a whole?
As a cycling fan, my whole life, I don't think there's any jersey more prestigious in the world than the rainbow jersey. I think it's massively impressive to say you're the world champion. I've been fortunate enough to see it a number of times in person. It's a magical thing to see, to sound perhaps a little bit more hopeful than others, but it's fabulous. And for these athletes who perhaps have been elite level athletes in other disciplines or obviously in other sports, we have Olympic medalists from other disciplines and other sports involved in esports. It gives them another opportunity to win a world championship. And then for some other athletes, perhaps they never dreamed of competing at an elite level, or they were never in that upper echelon of athletes to win a world championship. And here they are back at it again, so to speak. So I think it's fabulous. I think it's a unique opportunity that esports provides to give athletes either their first opportunity at elite level esports or another opportunity if they've already had it in a different discipline or a different sport. The rainbow jersey, in my opinion, is the most beautiful jersey on the face of the planet for cyclists. I think anybody would be well deserving to win it and be thankful to pull it on. And Chris, I know you've joked about sleeping in that jersey. I can tell you if I won one, I definitely wouldn't take it off. It's a pretty cool jersey to win. So best of luck to the athletes in Abu Dhabi.
It is indeed a pretty cool jersey to win. And there's not just the World Championships potentially on the table, is there? What role does the UCI play in the potential inclusion of cycling esports in the Olympic esports games?
Emma, I think you win the award for best segue of the episode there. That's a fantastic transition. We as the UCI will obviously be involved in any decision to be included in the Olympic esports games that was recently announced. I can say that we've been in communication with the IOC. We will make every effort from the UCI's perspective to be included in that event. It has to go through the IOC's invitation to tender, just like we were talking about with UCI World Championships. We're committed to being a member sport of that event, but time will tell. There's a lot to do between now and then. We'll make every effort we can from the UCI's perspective to make sure cycling esports is included in the Olympic esports games, certainly.
Is the UCI committed to cycling esports?
Absolutely. I think across the board, the organization's demonstrated that we're committed, and we're going to continue that commitment as long as we can.
So then what do you say to the person who listened to this entire podcast and still isn't convinced?
I think that's a difficult question, but the UCI has maintained its commitment through a delivery of the World Championships. Like I touched on in some previous answers, we're pushing forward on a number of initiatives. I think I said earlier, it's not like we can do everything all at once for everybody, but we're certainly trying to do as much as we can to push the discipline forward. And I would also claim or ask that person who doubts us to think about the UCI as just one member of the larger community, right? We've touched on the national federations, our commercial partners, whether it be platforms or hardware companies, and then the community at large as well. The sport is not beholden to any one party, nor is any one party in charge of it. The UCI certainly isn't claiming to be in charge of esports. We're trying to deliver a world championship to both men and women and allow the sport to continue to develop. And again, we're here to try and bring people to the table to have the difficult conversations and find a pathway forward for this discipline, regardless of any shifting interest from commercial partners or different sponsors that may come and go. The UCI is here to stay, and we're committed to helping grow and develop cycling esports for as long as we can.
I have one more question to ask you, Jacob, but before I do, I want to thank you very much. It's been extremely insightful and I think really valuable and impactful for the community to hear the UCI side of things. Just in conclusion, in an ideal world, as a fan, as the esports coordinator, where do you envision cycling esports in 5 years?
Very good question. And thank you guys for having me. I've been a fan of the podcast and the work you guys do in the community for quite a while. So thank you very much for inviting me and happy to have this conversation. And to anybody in the community, please reach out to us at the UCI or to myself directly if you ever want to have a conversation. I'm very passionate about this topic and will happily discuss it endlessly with anybody who so feels the need. From my perspective, in 5 years' time, I hope we have a commercially viable professional league. I think that would be a fantastic statement for our sport to make. A world tour of sorts for the esports level. How that comes to fruition and what that looks like, I think we all have unique ideas on. I grew up as a sports fan and had my local team's jersey in my closet as a kid and a poster of my favorite athlete over my bed. And certainly not to assign that to anybody else, but how neat would it be if your local city had a professional esports team, or perhaps your nation had an esports team in cycling esports that you could be a fan of? That would be fantastic. I definitely hope for a continued evolution of the World Championships. I work at the UCI and I'm very fortunate to do that and very thankful to do that. Whether I continue to work here or not in the future, regardless of that, I hope that the World Championships continues to evolve. I have an endless number of stories of going to other disciplines' World Championships and how impactful it is from a spectator standpoint. I remember when Michael Woods almost won, but Alejandro Valverde took it away in Innsbruck as one of many examples. And hopefully the next generation of cyclists can be inspired by esports athletes at the World Championship level, because again, I think that rainbow jersey is such a unique award. Well-deserving winners always pull it over their shoulders. And it would be a fantastic thing if in 5 years' time, the next generation could be inspired by that.
That's a lovely spot to finish, isn't it? Because that is just an inspirational vision of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys for having me. Like I said, I'm just one person at the UCI, and one person involved in such a large event. It really does take a massive number of folks, from very passionate community members and their Facebook posts that they think we don't read, but we do, all the way through to members at our partners like MyWhoosh and our independent bodies like the ITA, and even then the people I work with at the UCI. We're all dedicated to delivering a fantastic event in Abu Dhabi and helping this discipline grow. So thank you all very much for having me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
That'd be absolutely brilliant. And just before we go, I do want to mention the World Championship final in Abu Dhabi, because Chris, I understand there's going to be a live blog.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to try something new this year. I'm going to try to do some behind the scenes, some athlete interviews, and have a live blog on my site so we can get a picture of what's going on that you might not necessarily see on your broadcast, Emma. But I've recruited a good squad. First of all, we have you and Matt, your co-host. Lionel Vujasin is going to be adding some of his insights. Zach Neer, Jackie Godby from the U.S., the only podium finisher. And we also have our past guests, Josh Harris and Kate Turton. They're going to be there also providing some insight. So I think it's going to be pretty exciting. So during the event, actually starting a couple of days before, as the athletes are flying out there, we're going to have a live blog on the Zwift.com that you can check into. It'll be kind of like cycling Twitter.
I love that. Cycling Twitter, but potentially with photos and more characters. Superb. Well, you can follow that at the Zwift, which is where Chris has mentioned that live blog is going to be. You can subscribe to the Zwift website if you want more information on all things esports cycling, not just the World Championships. You can follow or subscribe to the Virtual Velo Podcast on YouTube or your favourite podcast provider. You can follow me on Instagram. You can follow the Zwift there too. We are going to be back shortly with the Virtual Velo Podcast, and next time we are going to be joined by Jason Osborne, a rider never off the podium so far in a cycling esports world championships. Well, he's heading to his fourth. Can he do it again? Well, we're going to catch up with him before he gets on that plane to Abu Dhabi. Until then, stay safe, enjoy your riding. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.